So what we're going to look at now is some of the major campaigns of the European theater of the war. Again, just kind of breezing through, unfortunately. I know some of you would probably like to look at some things in more detail. I'm going to give you some handouts here that are just for reference, okay? I've got two different maps here. Actually, it's four different maps. Let me get these handed out to you, then I'll tell you what I want you to do with these. They're just for your notes, and I'll explain in a second why there's two of them and all this kind of stuff. Don't freak out when you see this. This is just for a visual purpose. It's not anything you're going to have to learn or memorize. It's just so you can have a point of reference when I talk about places, because we're probably not all as brushed up on our European geography of where we're talking about. So again, these are just for your notes. This is just to give you a visual. Like I said, because some of us, if we talk about the French border or, whatever, a lot of us don't really have much of a point of reference in our mind of where that is. So what you've got on both of these, they both have a map of the European theater and the Pacific theater. And the only reason there's two of them is because I ran off one and decided it was not clear enough. I struggled to kind of find one that would copy really clear. And so I ran off another one, and I decided, maybe the other one's not so bad. Basically, I just couldn't decide which one I liked better and which one you would find easier to read. So I ultimately just did both of them, and I'll let you decide. Again, this is just for your own reference. It's not like you're going to have to learn any spots. You won't see any math questions on your test from me or anything like that. We will not be talking about all of these engagements as we go through it. Like I said, it's just for visual reference. I'll pull one out, and kind of point to some things, and you can keep it out and look at it if you find that helpful. But if you don't, don't worry about it. One of these also, the first European one has a lot of other information on their timeline. If you find that helpful, you're not going to have to know all of that. We're not going to talk about all of that, but like I said, it's really just more for a visual thing. So they both have European theater on one side, Pacific theater on the other side. Same thing on this one. You got European theater and Pacific theater. Which brings me to an important point about World War II, is that the United States is fighting a war on two very different fronts. So you have what's going on in Europe, which sometimes that fighting is actually going to include North Africa, which is something we're going to look at here in just a second, fighting Nazi Germany and Italy to a point. Fighting mostly with British forces, French forces, and Soviet forces. And then you have the second theater of war, the Pacific theater, in which the United States is fighting Japan on its own, without too much or hardly any help from Britain or France or other allies. Eventually, the Soviets pledged to join that fight, but it will end before they actually get engaged in that. So today, like I said, we're going to look at not all, but parts of the war in Europe, and I will refer to a couple of things on this map, again, just for a point of reference, but don't feel like you have to memorize any of that. It's just to kind of give you an understanding of where we are talking about. And some of what we're doing here also, we're just kind of laying the groundwork for some just terminology that gets used that a lot of you may be familiar with. I expect a lot of you are, but just in case you're not, we're going to just make sure that we kind of lay some basic groundwork here as well, like when we talk about the combatants, different names or various names we might use for those. So the first major campaign we're going to discuss is going to be the North Africa campaign. So we just said this is a war in Europe, so why is it involving Africa? Recall that Italians had invaded Ethiopia back in the 1930s, and German expansion had included moving into these northern parts of Africa, into parts of Egypt. You can see Libya on this map, and if you look at yours, that's what you're seeing right here at this. That's the bottom part of the map. That's Northern Africa. Now, again, just laying some groundwork first as far as some names to know. We'll talk a lot about the allies and the allied powers, and those are people you probably know who we're talking about, but let's just make sure we are clear when we talk about the allies who that means. That, of course, refers to the United States plus Britain and the Soviet Union. Now, sometimes you can also include France in that, so that wouldn't necessarily be wrong, because the United States is fighting, on the French side, but France, remember, is mostly occupied by Germany at this point. So they're on the same side, but they're not necessarily, at least at this point in the war, as involved in the planning and the strategy and all that, because they were essentially conquered. Yes, there's a resistance movement going on and all of that, and their role will become a little bit more pronounced as France is liberated. But for the most part, that means Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The leaders of those three countries, kind of are the minds behind the strategy and the planning. Sometimes referred to as the Big Three. So that would be certainly Roosevelt. His counterpart in the Soviet Union is who? Stalin, and his counterpart in Britain is Winston Churchill. So those three individuals are leading these allied powers. These are the allies. So when we talk about the allies, the allied powers, allied troops, allied forces, any of those things, that's talking mainly about those three nations. Again, it could include France if you're talking about soldiers. It could also include Canada, but that's not like, part of the decision-making process, but you could be talking about Canadian troops or something. But just make sure you know who we're talking about with that. The enemies, of course, would be the Axis, which of course is Germany, Italy for the most part, and of course Japan in the Pacific. So those are the major combatants of war. You probably learned that in middle school. Okay, so going back to the North Africa campaign, but again, before we get there, there's several, we try to keep the names, the people, the number of generals, and all that kind of stuff down to a minimum, but that we're, once again, just some names you're going to see constantly. You just need to know who these people are. Just, again, laying the groundwork for what is to come. Dwight D. Eisenhower commands American forces in Europe. So he is the commanding general of American forces in Europe. He will soon be the commander of all Allied forces in Europe. So eventually he will have command over all the Allied forces, not just the United States, but Britain and France as well. Soviets are kind of fighting on a different front for a long time. So that's a little bit different. So he is sort of the head guy in charge of the United States, certainly as they get involved in North Africa, and then eventually over the whole Allied invasion and the whole Allied fight. Some of you recognize that name. He eventually goes on to be president, but he's going to be, of course, big-time war hero as a result of this. So when you ever hear his name, just know who he is. Again, just on a side note, I mentioned the other day that this time we see the United States taking on a much bigger leadership role than you saw in World War I. Eisenhower, of course, being a prime example of that. He had American generals, commanding American forces, but in this case, you see American generals like Eisenhower commanding all of Allied forces eventually. Okay, so the North Africa campaign this is all, it's a campaign, it's months long. So it's not like it's just one battle. There are pivotal battles in it. But trying to keep it short and sweet, trying to narrow it down to just a couple of main points is kind of hard because this is really, it's really complex. But basically, this is the first major area first campaign in which American forces are really involved. So this is the first big fight that will involve American troops. So that's why, in the grand scheme of things for the United States, it stands out as significant. This was decided by that Big Three that this would be the first kind of place that they would go in trying to roll back that German advance, that North Africa would be the first place to choose. It's a complicated situation. Stalin is really pressuring and really wants a second front to be opened up because he's dealing with a huge amount of pressure from the Germans on his end, and he really wants that pressure relieved by a second front being opened up against Germany there in the west. But Britain and the United States felt it was not time to do that yet. They needed to soften up Germany a little bit, and so North Africa was chosen as the place to invade first. So there are, again, numerous key battles there. You can see some of them on your map, like El Alamein, I think, is on there, or it's on one of them. Basically, American forces come from one end, British and French British forces from another, and they eventually sort of squeeze Germany in the middle, sort of pinch them in and surround them. And eventually, German forces, or part of German forces in North Africa, are forced to surrender. And this was, fighting basically in the desert. It's incredibly ugly. This is when American forces were very, new at this. This is their first major engagement. So they are, kind of put into the slaughter very quick. They learn a lot here. This is kind of where American forces get conditioned and get a lot better, learn a lot of things, learn a lot of hard lessons. So they're better prepared and in a better situation after it. But with North Africa captured, again, that is the first time American forces really see significant action, and it kind of breaks in a lot of American troops. But it also paves the way for the next portion of their attack, which is going to be Italy. So this secures North Africa after that campaign, and they are able then to move into Italy. You see these arrows kind of pointing up, and your map does show that as well. Both of them do. So that's going to be the kind of next part of the plan. So they first secure North Africa, and then they're going to invade through Sicily and Italy, pushing Germany out of there first. They want to do that, soften up German forces there, break up Italian forces there before they open up that second front like Stalin is asking them to do. Okay, so American forces broken in, and the way now paved for the invasion of Italy. Now, these big three that I mentioned, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, throughout the war have numerous really momentous meetings together. There's several conferences that they hold in various parts of Europe, Africa, Soviet Union to further plan their invasion, plan the attack. After the invasion of North Africa, after the North Africa is secured, Roosevelt and Churchill meet at the Casablanca Conference. Casablanca is in northern Africa as well. You can probably find it on your map if you look. It's over on the northwestern portion of Africa. So June of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill meet at Casablanca. Stalin does not come, only because Soviet Union, and again, we don't have time to get into it, but the amount of fighting and the brutality and the ugliness that they are bearing the brunt of is just mind-boggling. It's just huge compared to what the American forces are dealing with, and all of that, and their involvement is really minuscule compared to what the Soviets were having to fight. And that's why Stalin is kind of pressuring, not kind of, but definitely pressuring American forces and British forces to open up this second front and take the pressure off of them. So he didn't want to leave a besieged Soviet Union to attend this conference. So he's kind of, there mentally, sending his best and sending what he wants, but he's not physically there. A couple of things that come out of the Casablanca Conference. They decide that they are going to increase their bombing of Germany. They want to bomb specific locations within Germany to try to reduce their ability to wage war, attacking factories and munitions plants and things like that, so that their invasion of Germany later on can be a little bit easier. And they also decide at the Casablanca Conference, and they agree on this a couple of times, but certainly at the Casablanca Conference, that they will demand an unconditional surrender of Germany. That's what they want, saying they want an unconditional surrender of Germany. In other words, saying it's not going to be enough for Germany just to retreat. It's not going to be enough just to push them back. We will fight them until they surrender without any condition, without any question. And that was actually kind of important to Stalin. Stalin, wanted to make sure that the other allies did not just get to a point where they got Germans on the run, and then Stalin has to deal with the rest of it himself, has to close the deal on his own. He wanted that assurance that, Britain and the United States were going to be in it, to the end. They would all push for a total defeat, total eradication of Nazism, and a total unconditional surrender. So that's going to lead to certain things, both good and bad. But further plans are made, and again, the plans for the invasion of Sicily and Italy are laid after that. So, again, we are not looking at specific battles and campaigns. I'm not, trying to look at get too much into that, but at the same time, it's kind of hard to describe it if you don't. So don't get hung up on these little details about this battle happened on this day and this many people were. I'm not going to ask you that. AP exam will definitely not ask you that. So don't get hung up on the little stuff. Think about big picture here, okay? But think about big picture. But I got to say something to illustrate, or else it's, why are we here? Okay, so after after North Africa is secured, that then leads to the next phase of the Allied fight is going to be Italy. But at the same time, again, this war is being fought in multiple places all at the same time. But another important theater of the fight, another important part, is the ongoing, this is not, again, it's not a one-time thing, this is an ongoing campaign that lasted the end of the war, was the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, this is a naval war on the Atlantic, obviously, which is why it's called the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to overcome German submarine attacks on the Atlantic, trying to secure, the shipping routes. Because the United States, again, is supplying the other allies with all sorts of stuff. The United States' role as an industrial power in bringing ships and supplies and guns and all of that stuff is crucial. But, of course, those ships, as they're going across the Atlantic, what's going to be happening to them? They're being sunk by German U-boats, same thing that you saw in World War I. And so the Battle of the Atlantic was to get control of that, was to, get Germany, to diminish Germany's power, to sink American ships, to sink those vessels, so that supplies and all of those things could be getting to Britain and France and the Soviet Union and all of that. So it is that attempt to control that, to secure the Atlantic, to get the upper hand in the naval war so they could continue to supply the rest of the allies. So again, this is not like a one-time thing. This goes on really for the whole war. Thousands of ships being lost. Eventually, technology is developed that helps the allies here, particularly things like sonar and radar are developed throughout the war. With things like sonar and radar, what are the allies going to be able to do? Detect those submarines so they can see them and have a better idea of where those attacks are going to happen. They also eventually break the German code, and so they're able to understand where attacks are going to be placed and kind of strategically decide where to send their ships. They start using convoys, kind of escorting these, supply ships with big destroyers so that they kind of have armed escorts. And eventually that turns the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. Again, it's not like it's ever over. They don't ever, just eradicate all the German submarines. But they do get them on the defensive, and they will get it to where they have the upper hand, and they're able to protect and pretty much send the supplies that they need to the allies. So that was an important phase of the war as well. So as well as the fighting in Africa and other places, and again, the Pacific stuff's going on at the same time, organizing and getting upper hand with the shipping part of it over the Atlantic was important as well. Now, moving back to the battlefield, that was all a naval war. So after North Africa is secured, the next objective was Italy, which you see there. So that's the next place. They're going to move upward. They decide that Italy is the next best place to attack. So starting with Sicily in 1943 and then invading up through Italy is their next plan. There are multiple battles involved in that. Again, we're not going into the specific ones. But ultimately, that results in, Mussolini being overthrown. And Italy actually switches sides at that point. So at some point in 1943, Mussolini is overthrown, and the new government of Italy kind of surprises everybody by switching sides, joining the Allies at that point, at least theoretically. Mussolini is Hitler kind of rescues him, kind of puts him in place of this sort of puppet government up in northern Italy for a while. So he's still claiming to hold power, but pretty much does not control Italy anymore. So the invasion of Italy and the liberation of Italy is eventually successful. Again, Mussolini is overthrown. Italy switches sides at that point. And at this point, now that those defenses and that part of the German invasion has been rolled back, they're getting more ready to plan opening up this second front like Stalin wants them to do. So after Italy is secured, we'll see another major conference between your big three, which that's what this picture shows. Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt all meeting together in Tehran, the Tehran Conference, which is in Iran. That's in Iran. I think that's on here. Let's see. It's not what? Not labeled. Okay. Yeah. It's on the other one. This one's so weird because it's a colored map. That European one is all copied very strangely. I just look at it every time. Stare and stare and stare. Okay. The major things at the Tehran Conference, this is where they start to lay specific plans for the opening of that second front, to open up this second front against Germany. They start laying those plans, and that attempt was a very calculated move. So they start laying those plans. Britain and the United States feeling more comfortable that the time may be getting about right to launch that invasion, to open up the second front in France, invade France, and start rolling back the German advance. Sort of in return, Stalin promises to eventually enter the war against Japan. So that's something that Roosevelt wants from him. It's to him to promise that he will eventually enter the war against Japan. And help once the war or once Germany is defeated. So there is that possibility as well. So here, sometime in 1943, they will start making plans for that opening of that second front, for the liberation of France, for the Allied invasion. Of course, making plans for what we eventually know of to be called D-Day. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So first of all, when we talk about opening a second front, invading France, if you're going, why are we invading France if they are our ally? Remember that France is occupied by Germany. So they're talking about invading France from England, going across the English Channel, and invading France, pushing out German forces that have occupied that for 2-3 years by this point, 3 years. So that's what we mean by opening up the second front and forcing Germany to fight, not only here, and not only, remember all this stuff, see all these battles going on around the Soviet Union? The idea is Stalin and the Soviet Union, they are pushing Germany from this way, while the United States, Britain, France, and Canada will all push from this way and eventually converge in the middle, okay, and converge on Germany that way. But in order to do that, they've got to open up this second front in France and invade France, okay? And that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, and it takes months and months and months of planning, everybody waiting for it to happen. And of course, that Allied invasion is launched on the day that comes to be called D-Day. The actual military operation was called Operation Overlord, and it began, D-Day for that Operation Overlord, of course, was June 6, 1945. They chose Normandy, France as the specific place to launch that invasion. And you can see that on this map. It's teeny tiny right there. You see the English Channel between England and France. You can see it there. It's a little bit easier to see on the other one. It's a little bit bigger. And there it is. See? Okay. So for months and months and months, they plan, they wait for the right moment, try to fool Germany, because everybody kind of knows it's going to happen. Even Germany knows that this is imminent. It's a question of where and when. And they use deception tactics to force or try to trick Germany into thinking that it's going to happen in a different place where they have like this whole like fake army deployed. Not a fake army, but they had like inflatable tanks and things there so that Germany would see it and think that's where the invasion was coming. And the thing is, they did successfully fool them, and they did get the element of surprise. And most of you know this, kind of how this whole thing goes. But early in the morning, they launched this massive attack across the English Channel. More than 5,000 ships of men, of soldiers from the United States, from Britain, from Canada, these amphibious craft like you see here that were supposed to come onto the beaches, and their goal was to get control of those beaches in Normandy, to control the beachhead so they can then start bringing in more and more troops, more and more supplies, more and more vehicles, and start pushing through German-occupied France. And again, if you've seen, or heard anything about it, you know how brutal and ugly this was. a lot of things went wrong in the beginning. You know, they were supposed to, they first sent troops, kind of dropped them behind enemy lines, and were supposed to send out air missions to bomb some of the German positions so that some of their defenses would be softened up. And a lot of it, the weather was bad and they couldn't see their targets. And so none of that stuff got broken up, particularly on Omaha Beach, which I think that's where this picture is from. So that's where the ugliest of fighting happened, because not only did none of the German defenses get broken up at all or destroyed at all, they're up on these cliffs and these guys are having to basically wade through water, some of which was over their head. This first wave of attacks, some of them suffered about 90% casualties in the beginning. Thousands and thousands of casualties. However, eventually German casualties are more. Eventually Germans start running out of ammunition. Eventually they do start getting support from destroyers and air support to loosen up and soften up some of those German positions. And so it takes several days, and it certainly was one of the uglier of the fights, but they eventually do secure those beaches. So D-Day and this whole operation becomes a turning point in the war, because it means that they can now start turning back that German advance, start turning back that German occupation. With those beaches secured, victory is kind of in sight. It's going to take months more, but that means that they can now start bringing in more forces. It starts with these, probably about 400,000 men, but within 2 weeks, they've got 1 million landed on those shores. They've got thousands of vehicles, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and they already controlled the air, really. So this is a turning point in the war, where they can start moving through France and continuing to break up German defenses there and liberating France from German occupation, which they do by August. So by August of 1945, most of France has been liberated. Paris has been liberated by that point. And so they'll continue moving toward, moving in toward German territory by this point, while the Soviets continue to push from the other side. Okay, so what I want to do, real quick, first of all, any general questions? So what we're going to do, and I know some of you have seen this, D-Day, all this stuff really, it's so complex. It really is mind-boggling trying to describe it. It really is hard to stand up there and talk about it because there's just too much to say without making it overcomplicated. So sometimes it's better just to see it. So we're going to watch, and I don't doubt that some of you have seen this. I bet some of you have seen this whole movie. We're going to watch the first 5 minutes of a film that depicts D-Day. So, and I bet a lot of you have probably seen it, but some of you may have not. This is going to depict in those first moments, specifically at Omaha Beach, where things were the ugliest, where things went really wrong. This is very, very graphic. Okay, this is a lot of blood and guts. It is not pretty. You're going to see blood. You're going to see body parts. You're going to see brains. You're going to see vomit. All of it. That's another thing that was kind of wrong, is that the seas were really rough, and these aircraft were having, or these watercraft rather, were having to deal with waves that were like 6 feet high. And so half of them were seasick by the time they even get there. So you're going to see that. So we're going to see this just to kind of give you an idea of, hold on just a second, let me get this recording off. And I debated whether or not to even show this, but I decided I'm going to do it. So that's what we're going to do. I did get permission to show it, even though this is pretty nasty.